So I have a blog or a webpage called Tall Black One Sugar. And in that space for a number of years now, for about 5 or 6 years, I've been writing on some political ideas around race, around central government, around social economics and politics. And I've been toying with the idea of being able to do a vlog. And I decided that I'm going to try and do a weekly one. I don't know whether or not it's going to work. I do a podcast as well, so I don't know how I'm going to be able to balance up the two. But I thought I'd start off by talking or doing this vlog and seeing how far it goes. So today, I thought I'd really start it off with a bit of energy, specifically talking around this, the sacking of the black transgender model, Monroe Bergdorf, who got dropped by L'Oreal. And there has been a lot of thought pieces around the actual the sacking itself and some of the stuff that she said. But I thought what I'd like to do first and foremost in this one is just have a really quick just stream of thought around why I think race conversations will always be difficult, especially here in the UK. I can't speak for any other country. I don't know about the racism in China, in Zimbabwe, in Brazil, Sweden, America. I'm just going to talk from a UK perspective. And I think it's really important for people to recognise that if you're going to start a conversation about race, we need to be at least speaking from the same book or from the same definition. So there are a couple of things that I think stop these conversations from going forward any further. So for example, I remember a couple of weeks ago, there was a conversation in education Twitter, where one of the writers spoke about race being an indicator of education. Now, there are obviously a lot of people who give pushback because they were saying race is not scientific, it's more social. So if somebody's raising an issue around race, around IQ, that can be quite problematic. Quite recently, there was another comment around Charlottesville and all the issues that raised around there and white privilege and all those words that have been bandied about. I think it's really important when we have these discussions, whether it's about black people, white people, Asian people, brown people, or whatever the other binaries people choose to use or definitions they choose to use, that we actually have agreed terms. So, for example, for me, when I talk about race, I'm talking about structural racism. No matter whatever country you're in, whatever the dominant race is, and we know that we live in a world where dominant races run a country, that racism is not just about an individual act, and individual acts are there, but it's more so about what are the structures in place that allow people to be treated differently because of their race, and how does that affect people along the line? So, for example, if I walk down the street and somebody called me a colour or a nigger, or if somebody called me a black bastard or what have you, or if I went back and I called somebody a packy or a chink or a honky or whatever all those kind of derogatory terms are, those are individual acts. They are supported by a system that says that races are different, and so that, effectively, although it may not be politically correct to be able to put those things out there in the open, you can get in trouble. The fact is that we have a system where there is a division amongst race. It's not scientific, but it is a social construct that stays in place. So for me, when we are talking about things like privilege, when we are talking about things like defining race, there's no way that we're going to be able to move our conversation forward unless we understand where we're coming from and if there is a similarity around our definitions. It's easy to bandy about the things like social justice warrior, all these other kind of nonsense labels. But if we're talking about race specifically and how it affects people, we need to have a simple and shared definition. Now, I know for me, as I said, it's around structural racism. It's around the way that things are put together. I know for a fact that if I walk down the road at a certain time, that there are individuals who may treat me differently, depending on what I wear. If I go in my hoodie, there are some people sometimes who may cross the road, and I'm not just talking about white people, I've seen black people do it as well, and brown people. It may be that when I walk into a room and I'm talking to individuals, there may be an anticipation about it. Racial biases exist, and it just doesn't go one way. I believe it goes two ways, because I think racism engenders that all people will treat people slightly differently. There will be a reaction or an action based on prejudices, based on assumptions, and based on the actual system that we have. So for me, if we are really going to have a conversation and move it forward, I think we need to have things that are similar. I think that we need to have things that will allow us to not just be throwing things at each other and accusing people and using really harsh and really aggressive language, but thinking, what is it that we're actually trying to discuss here if we are having a discussion? If we're not, it's just an argument, fine, by all means, raise up your hand, you're only going to be there to go and argue with people. But if we're having a solid debate about how do we tackle racism, how do we own dealing with that, rather than just throwing the onus on one person or the other person, people getting all upset by blanket statements, I think it's important, if we really are going to move it forward, that we have a real consensus as to what we see or how we define racism, and then move it forward as to how it affects us as individuals. That's my first one. Didn't want to make it too controversial. Thank you very much for listening, and tune in next week for the next episode of me on Tall Black, One Sugar.